your job!
I'm going to need you to move to the back of the plane. This section is for our premium passengers. Those words hung in the air like poison as 50-year-old flight attendant Patricia Holbrook stood over seat 23B, her arms crossed, her face twisted into a mask of authority and contempt. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval. 23 years she'd worked for the airline. 23 years of service pins gleaming on her navy blue uniform. And now, she was staring down at a 12-year-old black girl with all the weight of that authority behind her eyes. The girl looked up, confusion flickering across her face. She was small for her age, wearing a gray hoodie with Cascade Gifted Academy emblazoned across the chest in gold letters. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids, and her brown eyes held a mixture of disbelief and determination. "Ma'am, this is my seat. 23B. Around them, passengers were turning in their seats. Some were reaching for their phones. The quiet hum of the aircraft was replaced by a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Patricia's hand extended toward the girl's boarding pass, her fingers trembling slightly, not with age, but with barely contained frustration. But before we understand how this moment exploded into something that would change multiple lives forever, we need to go back. Back 24 hours to a small house in Portland, Oregon, where a young genius was preparing for the journey of a lifetime, with no idea that the greatest test she'd face wouldn't be in a conference room, but 30,000 feet in the air. Raven Johnson had always been different. Not just smart, brilliant. The kind of brilliant that makes adults uncomfortable because it forces them to reconsider what a child is capable of. At 12 years old, she'd already mastered calculus, taught herself 3 programming languages, and spent her weekends not at the mall, but in her makeshift laboratory in the garage, tinkering with filtration systems and water quality sensors. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on the east side of Portland with her grandmother, Loretta Johnson. Loretta was 68, a retired librarian whose home still smelled like old books and lavender tea. She'd raised Raven since the girl was 3, after Raven's parents died in a car accident on I-5 during a winter storm. Loretta had been the only family Raven had ever really known, and the bond between them was more than grandmother and granddaughter. It was soulmates separated by 5 decades. On this particular morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Raven sat at their small dining table, her hands trembling as she held a cream-colored envelope. Loretta stood at the stove making scrambled eggs, but her own hands shook slightly as she gripped the spatula. Early-stage Parkinson's. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago, and while the tremor was still subtle, both of them knew what it meant. Time was precious. Every moment mattered. "Open it, baby," Loretta said softly, though she already knew what it said. The letter had arrived yesterday, and Raven had been too nervous to open it alone. Raven's fingers slid under the flap and she pulled out the letter. Her eyes scanned the words once, twice, 3 times as if she couldn't believe what she was reading. "Dear Miss Johnson, congratulations. You have been selected as one of 50 students nationwide to attend the National Youth Science Summit in Washington, D.C. Raven's voice cracked as she read aloud. 50 students. Out of thousands of applicants from every state in the country. 50 young minds chosen to present their research to actual scientists, policymakers, and educators who could change the world. Her project was a water purification system designed specifically for underserved communities. Low cost, easy to maintain, powered by solar energy. She developed it after learning that some neighborhoods in America, wealthy America, still didn't have access to clean drinking water. It had started as a science fair project and had grown into something that consumed her every waking thought. Loretta turned from the stove, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She crossed the small kitchen and pulled Raven into an embrace so tight the girl could barely breathe. "I'm so proud of you," Loretta whispered. "Your mama would be so proud." But even in that moment of pure joy, there was something else in Loretta's eyes. Worry. Because this wasn't just about a science summit. This was Raven's first time flying alone. This was her first time navigating the world as a young black girl without protection, without someone there to shield her from the things Loretta had spent 9 years trying to prepare her for. Loretta pulled back, holding Raven's face in her trembling hands. "Baby, listen to me. You're about to do something incredible. You're going to walk into rooms where you're the youngest, where you might be the only one who looks like you, and you're going to shine. But I need you to understand something." Raven nodded, her expression serious now. "The world isn't always going to see your brilliance first. Some people, they're going to see your skin before they see your mind. They're going to make assumptions. They're going to underestimate you. And when that happens, when you feel invisible or dismissed or like you don't belong, I need you to remember who you are. Stand tall, baby girl. Stand tall. Raven didn't fully understand what her grandmother meant. Not yet. But she would. Oh, she would. Portland International Airport was chaos on a Tuesday morning. Business travelers rushing to gates, families herding children through security, the constant drone of announcements echoing through the terminals. Loretta and Raven stood at the security checkpoint, and for the first time in years, Loretta looked small. Fragile. Her hand gripped Raven's shoulder as if letting go meant losing her forever. You have your phone? Your charger? The hotel confirmation. Yes, Grandma. We checked 3 times. And you'll call me the second you land? I promise. Around Raven's neck hung a bright yellow lanyard that read Unaccompanied Minor, in bold black letters. It felt simultaneously like a badge of honor and a target. She was mature enough to travel alone, but young enough to need supervision. The airline had protocols. An attendant would escort her to the gate, someone would meet her on the other end. Everything was arranged. Loretta knelt down, ignoring the protest from her knees, and looked directly into Raven's eyes. You are brilliant. You are worthy. You are enough. Don't let anyone make you forget that. Raven nodded, blinking back tears she didn't want to cry in public. She hugged her grandmother one more time, breathing in the scent of lavender and old books, trying to memorize the feeling of safety. Then she walked through security alone. On the other side, a TSA agent named Deshawn, a broad-shouldered black man in his 30s with kind eyes, noticed her lanyard and smiled. First time flying solo? Raven nodded. Where you headed? National Youth Science Summit. In D.C. Deshawn's eyebrows shot up. No kidding? That's a big deal. What's your project? Water purification systems for communities without clean water access. He let out a low whistle. 12 years old and changing the world. Listen, you're going to do amazing things. Keep your head up. Those words carried her all the way to gate C7, where Flight 447 to Washington Dulles was already boarding. Raven watched as first-class passengers disappeared down the jetway, followed by premium passengers, then finally her group. She clutched her backpack, inside of which was her laptop, her presentation notes, 3 backup USB drives, and a photograph of her grandmother she'd tucked into the front pocket. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, and as Raven walked down the narrow aisle, she noticed the division immediately. First class with their wide leather seats and complimentary champagne. Then the curtain. Then Economy Plus where she was seated. Then regular economy stretching back toward the rear. In first class, a woman in her late 30s sat with expensive noise-canceling headphones, tapping away at a laptop. Designer glasses, perfectly tailored blazer, an aura of success that seemed to radiate from her. Sylvia Chen, though Raven didn't know her name yet. Texio. Self-made. Flying to D.C. for a congressional hearing on digital privacy. Raven found row 23 and slid into seat B, the middle seat. To her left in 23A sat a man in his mid-40s, Brett Donovan, already absorbed in his tablet, noise-canceling earbuds firmly in place. He didn't look up when she sat down. Didn't acknowledge her at all. His expensive suit and Rolex suggested he was someone important, or at least someone who wanted others to think he was. Behind her in row 24, the Morrison family was struggling with a toddler who clearly did not want to be on this plane. The mother looked exhausted, the father frustrated, and the child was working up to a world-class meltdown. And in row 25, Gerald Kemp settled into his seat with the careful movements of a man whose body had been through decades of hard work. 62 years old, retired postal worker, black with gray threading through his close-cropped hair. He'd seen things in his life. Experienced things. And he noticed things other people missed, like the young black girl traveling alone with an unaccompanied minor lanyard, clutching her backpack like it contained all her dreams. Raven pulled out her notebook, the one with the worn cover that she'd filled with equations and diagrams and ideas. She began reviewing her presentation, mouthing the words silently. She'd practiced it 100 times with Loretta, but she wanted it perfect. This was her chance. Her one shot to make a difference. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Raven watched dutifully, though her mind was already in Washington, already imagining standing before panels of experts, explaining her work, answering their questions. She had no idea that before this plane touched down, before she ever reached that summit, she'd face a test that no science class could prepare her for. She had no idea that a woman named Patricia Holbrook was working this flight, clipboard in hand, already scanning the passengers with eyes that had learned to make judgments in seconds. And she had no idea that in less than 30 minutes, she'd have to choose between staying silent or standing tall. If you want to see what happens when Raven is forced to defend her right to simply exist in the seat she paid for, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about courage. Here's what I want to know. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a situation where you knew people were judging you unfairly? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's talk about it. The engines roared to life. Flight 447 pushed back from the gate. And somewhere in the galley, Patricia Holbrook was preparing her beverage cart, completely unaware that this flight would be her last. The seatbelt sign dinged off with that familiar chime, and the aircraft settled into its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Through the small oval windows, clouds stretched out like cotton fields, and somewhere far below, the patchwork of America scrolled by unseen. Inside the cabin, the rituals of air travel began. Laptops emerged from bags. Neck pillows were positioned. And from the forward galley, the beverage cart rattled to life. Patricia Holbrook gripped the metal cart with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and deliberate after 23 years of repetition. She'd done this thousands of times. Smiled thousands of forced smiles. Served thousands of passengers who barely saw her as human, just a uniform dispensing drinks and pretzels. But Patricia had her own system, her own way of reading people. Who deserved her best service? Who didn't? She started in first class, of course. That's where the real passengers sat. The ones who mattered. Sylvia Chen received her sparkling water with lime without even looking up from her laptop, a brief nod of acknowledgement that Patricia accepted as sufficient. First-class passengers didn't need to be grateful. They'd paid for indifference. Then Patricia pushed through the curtain into Economy Plus, and her eyes swept across the rows with the calculating precision of someone sorting mail. Row 21, businessman with expensive watch, tomato juice. Row 22, elderly couple returning from visiting grandchildren, coffee for him, tea for her. Row 23, seat A, Brett Donovan already had his hand raised slightly, and Patricia glided over smoothly. What can I get you, sir? Brett didn't look up from his tablet. Scotch. Neat. And water. Of course, sir. Patricia poured with care, ensuring the scotch reached exactly the right level, not too much, not too little. She placed it on his tray table with the water beside it, the napkin folded just so. Brett grunted something that might have been thanks. And then Patricia's eyes slid to seat 23B. Raven sat there, her notebook open, completely absorbed in her presentation notes. She was mouthing words silently, her finger tracing equations on the page. She didn't notice Patricia standing right there, didn't notice the way Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, didn't notice the slight pause before the cart began moving again. Patricia breezed past her entirely. Row 24, the Morrison family. The mother looked desperate for caffeine, the father for alcohol, and the toddler for literally anything to keep him occupied. Patricia served them with efficient sympathy. Row 25, Gerald Kemp, coffee black, which he accepted with a warm smile and a "thank you, miss," that Patricia barely acknowledged. Raven looked up from her notebook as Patricia's cart rolled past on its way back up the aisle. She'd expected service. She'd been watching everyone else receive their drinks. But maybe the attendant had just missed her? It happens. No big deal. Excuse me, may I have some water, please? Raven's voice was polite, even a little timid. She raised her hand slightly, the way you do in class when you're not entirely sure if it's the right time to speak. Patricia stopped. The cart halted with a slight metallic rattle. She turned and for the first time really looked at Raven. Not looked at her the way you look at a passenger. Looked at her the way you examine something that doesn't quite fit, something out of place, something that requires investigation. Her eyes traveled from Raven's braided hair to her gifted academy hoodie to her notebook covered in equations to the yellow unaccompanied minor lanyard around her neck. And something shifted in Patricia's expression. Something cold. Passengers in this section ordered special meals, Patricia said, her voice clipped. Did your guardian purchase that for you? There was a pause before the word guardian. Just a fraction of a second, but it landed like a weight. Raven blinked, confused. No ma'am, I just wanted water. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. I'll get to you when I have time. And just like that, she turned and pushed the cart away, leaving Raven sitting there with her hands still half raised, a knot of confusion forming in her stomach. Minutes passed. 10, 15, 20. Patricia made a second pass through the cabin. This time she was collecting trash, offering refills, checking on passengers with that flight attendant smile that never quite reached her eyes. She stopped at Brett's seat, asked if he needed another scotch. He did. She poured it carefully. She asked the Morrison family if they needed anything else. More crackers for the toddler, which she provided with exaggerated patience. She checked on Gerald, who was reading a newspaper and declined a refill with thanks. And she walked right past Raven again. This time it wasn't confusion Raven felt. It was something else. Something that made her skin prickle and her throat tighten. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself there was a reasonable explanation. But her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Some people see your skin before they see your mind. No, that couldn't be it. Not here. Not on a plane full of people in the year 2024. That wasn't possible. Except it was happening right in front of her. Raven raised her hand again, more deliberately this time. Excuse me? Patricia was 3 rows away, her back to Raven, chatting pleasantly with a passenger about turbulence predictions. Excuse me, ma'am? Patricia finished her conversation, laughed at something the passenger said, and then slowly, deliberately turned around. She walked back to row 23, and the look on her face was one of barely concealed annoyance. What is it now? No. As if Raven had been bothering her all flight. I still haven't gotten water, and I need to take my medication. This was true. Raven had a vitamin regimen her grandmother insisted on, supplements for focus and cognitive function that Loretta had researched extensively. She needed to take them with food or water, and they were supposed to be taken at specific times. It was nearly time. Patricia let out a sigh. Not a small sigh. A dramatic, theatrical sigh that seemed designed to communicate to everyone within earshot that this child was being unreasonably demanding. Let me see your boarding pass again. Raven's confusion deepened. You already saw it when I boarded. I need to see it again. Raven fumbled in her backpack side pocket, pulled out the folded boarding pass and handed it over. Patricia examined it like a detective studying evidence at a crime scene. She held it up to the light. She checked the seat number against the number above Raven's head. She looked at Raven's name, then at Raven's face, then back at the boarding pass. 23B, Patricia said slowly. This is Economy Plus. Are you sure you're in the right seat? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Yes, ma'am. My grandmother purchased this seat specifically. Patricia's eyebrows rose. These seats are typically for business travelers. There are plenty of regular economy seats in the back. Perhaps there was a mix-up with your reservation? Raven felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Anger. Real anger. The kind that makes your hands shake and your vision narrow. There's no mix-up. This is my seat. Brett Donovan had been trying to ignore the conversation happening 12 inches to his right. He'd perfected the art of tuning out the world, of existing in his own bubble of productivity and scotch. But it was becoming impossible to ignore the tension radiating from the middle seat, impossible to ignore the flight attendant's tone, impossible to ignore the growing certainty that something very wrong was happening right next to him. He pulled out one earbud and looked up. Is there a problem? The transformation in Patricia Holbrook was instantaneous and absolute. Her entire body language shifted. The hard edges softened. The tight mouth curved into a smile. Her voice, which had been clipped and cold with Raven, suddenly dripped with professional warmth. Oh no, sir, just making sure everyone is comfortable. Can I get you anything else? Another drink, perhaps. Brett glanced at Raven, then back at Patricia. She just asked for water. That seems pretty simple. Patricia's smile never wavered. Of course, sir. I was just verifying some information about her seating assignment. Standard procedure. She turned back to Raven, and as she did, her body angled in a way that partially excluded Brett from the conversation. Her voice dropped, taking on a tone that was somehow both syrupy and condescending. Sweetheart, wouldn't you be more comfortable with your own kind in the back? I'm sure we can find you a nice seat back there where you won't feel so out of place. The words landed like physical blows. Raven's eyes widened. She'd heard stories. Her grandmother had told her about moments like this, had tried to prepare her. But hearing about discrimination and experiencing it are two entirely different things. This wasn't a history lesson. This wasn't a movie. This was happening to her, right now, and suddenly she understood exactly what her grandmother had meant. Some people see your skin before they see your mind. Raven's voice came out smaller than she wanted, trembling despite her efforts to control it. This is my seat. I have my boarding pass. Patricia's expression hardened. Don't take that tone with me, young lady. Where are your parents? I'm traveling alone to a science summit. Patricia's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. Alone? At your age? I find that hard to believe. What kind of parents let a 12-year-old fly across the country by herself? Are you sure you didn't just wander onto this plane? Around them, other passengers were starting to notice. The Morrison mother in row 24 had stopped trying to calm her toddler and was staring at the interaction with growing concern. Gerald Kemp in row 25 had lowered his newspaper entirely, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Patricia with an expression that combined recognition and disgust. Brett Donovan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could see where this was going. He could see the injustice of it. And yet, there was a part of him that wanted to just put his earbud back in, return to his tablet, pretend this wasn't his problem. Raven's hands were shaking now, but she reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder. Inside was her boarding pass, yes, but also her school ID, her summit acceptance letter, and the airline's documentation approving her as an unaccompanied minor. Here. This is everything. My boarding pass. My ID. My approval to fly alone. Everything's in order. Patricia barely glanced at the documents. Anyone can fake papers these days. I've seen it 100 times. Kids trying to sneak into better seats, claiming they paid for upgrades they didn't. If you're watching this and your blood is boiling right now, good. It should be. Hit that subscribe button because this story is about to get even more intense, and you need to see how this plays out. 13 to 1500 hours. Patricia reached for the call button on the wall panel, pressing it twice in quick succession. Somewhere in the aircraft, a chime sounded, and within seconds, another flight attendant appeared from the forward galley. Douglas Hammond was 42 years old, a lead flight attendant who'd worked his way up through seniority and adherence to protocol. He was by the book in every way, the kind of person who believed that rules existed for a reason and that following them kept everyone safe. He wore his authority comfortably, not cruelly, but without much room for interpretation. Patricia leaned in close, whispering to Douglas while both of them looked directly at Raven. The girl sat there, documents still clutched in her hands, watching as two adults discussed her fate like she wasn't even present. She could see their lips moving. Could see Patricia gesturing toward the back of the plane. Could see Douglas's expression shift from neutral to concerned. Douglas approached row 23, his posture official, his voice measured. "Miss, we're going to need to verify your ticket with the gate." Raven looked up at him, and for the first time tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. But she blinked them back. She would not cry. She would not give them that. What? No one else had to verify their ticket. Douglas shifted his weight slightly. It's protocol for unaccompanied minors in premium sections. We need to ensure everything is properly documented. I have everything right here. Raven held up her folder again. My boarding pass, my ID, my letter from the airline approving my solo travel. Everything you could possibly need. Douglas took the documents and examined them carefully. His eyes traveled over the boarding pass, checked the seat assignment against the overhead bin number, looked at the summit acceptance letter with its official letterhead, verified the airline's unaccompanied minor documentation. Everything was legitimate. Everything was in perfect order. There was absolutely no reason to question this child's right to be in this seat. He looked at Patricia, confusion flickering across his face. Patricia leaned in again. I still think there's been some mistake. Perhaps she swapped seats with someone. You know how they do. The word hung between them like smoke. Douglas hesitated. He could see the documents were legitimate. He could see the growing number of passengers watching this interaction. He could sense that something was very wrong with this situation. But Patricia had been with the airline for over 2 decades. She was senior. She'd filed complaints about passengers before, and they'd always been taken seriously. Miss Johnson, Douglas said carefully, using the name from her boarding pass, everything appears to be in order here. However, given the concerns raised, perhaps it would be easier if we... I've been watching. The voice came from row 25. Gerald Kemp had stood up, all 6 feet of him, his postal worker's frame still solid despite retirement. He'd spent 40 years delivering mail in neighborhoods where he'd seen things that would make most people weep. He'd lived through the civil rights movement as a young man. He'd experienced discrimination so casual, so normalized, that it had become invisible to those who perpetrated it. But he could still see it. Clear as day. That child hasn't moved since she sat down. She's been in her assigned seat the whole time, reviewing what looks like scientific notes. She's asked politely for water and been ignored for half an hour. And now you're treating her like she's committed a crime. What's really going on here? Patricia whirled on him, her professional mask finally cracking. Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please return to your seat. It concerns me when I see a child being harassed on an airplane. It concerns me when I see someone being treated differently than every other passenger in this section. It concerns me when I see history repeating itself at 35,000 feet. The Morrison mother spoke up, her toddler momentarily forgotten. He's right. I've been watching too. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's just sitting there and she's being treated like she doesn't belong. Brett Donovan finally pulled out both earbuds. I'm right next to her. She's been completely appropriate. She asked for water. That's it. Why is this even an issue? Patricia's face flushed red. This is a safety matter. If all of you would just mind your own business. What safety matter? Gerald's voice was calm but carried the weight of decades of righteous anger held in check. A 12-year-old girl sitting in her assigned seat is a safety matter? Asking for water is a safety matter? Or is the real problem that she doesn't look like you think she should look to be sitting in this section? Douglas Hammond stood frozen between Patricia and the growing number of passengers who were now openly staring. He'd been trained for medical emergencies, for unruly passengers, for turbulence and equipment failures. But this was something else entirely. This was a situation where every choice he made would define him, where neutrality itself was a choice, where protocol was being weaponized against the child. And in seat 23B, Raven Johnson sat with her documents still clutched in her hands, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. Stand tall, baby girl. Stand tall. She didn't know it yet, but in the cockpit someone was listening. Someone who'd heard variations of this scene play out before. Someone who'd experienced it herself. Someone who was about to make a choice that would change everything. Let me ask you something. If you were a passenger on this plane, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent? Drop your honest answer in the comments because this is the question that defines who we are. The tension in the cabin was reaching a breaking point. And what happened next would prove that sometimes, justice comes from the most unexpected places. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. There are moments in life when everything hangs in balance. When the choice you make defines not just the moment but who you become. When staying silent feels safer but speaking up is the only thing that matters. For 12-year-old Raven Johnson, 35,000 feet above America, that moment had arrived. She sat in seat 23B, surrounded by adults arguing about her fate, documents clutched in trembling hands, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Part of her wanted to shrink. Part of her wanted to just move to the back of the plane, avoid the conflict, make it all go away. It would be easier. It would be safer. But then she heard her grandmother's voice, as clear as if Loretta were sitting right beside her. Stand tall, baby girl. Stand tall. Raven took a breath. Steady. The kind of breath you take before diving into cold water, before stepping onto a stage, before changing everything. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the cabin with a clarity that surprised even her. Ma'am, I don't know why you're treating me differently than other passengers, but I have every right to be in this seat. I'm not moving. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Patricia Holbrook's face flushed crimson, a color that started at her collar and crept up her neck like a thermometer measuring rage. Her hands clenched at her sides. 23 years of authority, 23 years of passengers doing what she told them to do, 23 years of control, and now this 12-year-old child was defying her in front of everyone. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, Patricia said, her voice rising, losing the professional veneer it had maintained moments before. And I'm telling you to move to the rear of the plane. That's an order. Raven's hands were shaking. She could feel every eye in the section on her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. But her voice, when it came, was steady. Come. The voice of someone who'd found something inside themselves they didn't know existed. And I'm telling you no. Unless there's a safety issue, I'm staying in my assigned seat. The word, no, echoed through the cabin like a bell. Simple. Direct. Powerful. Patricia stepped closer, leaning in, her voice dropping to a hiss that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. Your attitude is creating a disturbance. If you don't comply, I'll have you removed at the next stop. They'll be waiting for you. Security. Police. Is that what you want? It was a threat designed to terrify. To make a 12-year-old child imagine herself being escorted off a plane in handcuffs. Imagine the shame, imagine the fear, imagine her grandmother's face when she got the call. But Raven had spent 2 years developing a water purification system. 2 years solving problems that seemed impossible. 2 years learning that the hardest challenges require the clearest thinking. And in that moment, looking up at Patricia Holbrook's angry face, Raven's mind worked with the same precision she applied to scientific equations. Then you'll have to explain to your supervisor why you're removing a 12-year-old honor student from her paid seat for no reason. Her voice broke slightly on the last words, the tremor revealing how scared she actually was. But she didn't back down. Didn't look away. Didn't surrender. Around them, phones emerged from pockets and bags. The soft glow of screens lit up faces throughout the section. The Morrison mother had her phone pointed directly at Patricia. A businessman 2 rows back was recording. Another passenger across the aisle had already started filming. And then Brett Donovan, the man in seat 23A who'd spent most of the flight trying to ignore everything happening 12 inches away, did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone, held it up so Patricia could see it clearly, and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm recording this too. Just so everyone knows." It wasn't heroic. It wasn't particularly brave. Brett Donovan wasn't suddenly transformed into a champion of justice. But he'd finally reached the point where staying silent would cost him more than speaking up. Where being a witness to injustice made him complicit in it. Where the easiest path and the right path had finally, thankfully, diverged in a way he couldn't ignore. Patricia looked at the phones, looked at the passengers, looked at the situation spiraling beyond her control, and something flickered across her face. Not regret. Not understanding. But the first hints of fear. The realization that this wasn't going to end the way she'd planned. The commotion had traveled forward, carried by the acoustics of the narrow tube they all shared. In first class, behind the curtain that separated the premium from the merely comfortable, Sylvia Chen had been only partially aware of the disturbance. She'd been absorbed in her work, preparing testimony for a congressional hearing that could reshape digital privacy laws for millions of Americans. But even through noise-canceling headphones, even through the barrier of focus that had made her one of the most successful tech CEOs in the country, Sylvia couldn't ignore the growing tension. The tone of voices. The unmistakable sound of conflict. She removed her headphones and listened. Really listened. And what she heard made her blood run cold. Sylvia stood up, her 5'4" frame somehow commanding despite its size, and walked back through the curtain into Economy Plus. Her designer blazer and confident stride marked her as someone important, someone who expected to be listened to, someone who'd built an empire from nothing and wasn't about to tolerate injustice at 35,000 feet. What's happening here? Patricia turned, her professional mask snapping back into place like a shield. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This is under control." Sylvia looked at Patricia, then at Douglas, then at the 12-year-old girl sitting in 23B with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes but her chin still raised, still defiant, still refusing to surrender. And Sylvia saw herself 25 years ago. Different circumstances. Different details. Same fundamental injustice. "It doesn't look under control," Sylvia said, her voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and congressional hearings. "It looks like you're bullying a child." She turned to Raven, her expression softening. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Raven swallowed hard. "Raven Johnson. I'm going to the National Youth Science Summit." Time seemed to stop. Sylvia's eyes widened, and a smile broke across her face, genuine and warm and suddenly transforming her from intimidating CEO to something more human. "You're one of the 50? My company is one of the sponsors. I'm Sylvia Chen, Quantum Core Technologies." Quantum Core. Raven knew that name. Every student selected for the summit knew that name. They were one of the major tech companies funding the entire program, providing not just money but mentorship, resources, connections that could launch careers. Sylvia Chen wasn't just a tech CEO. She was a legend. A self-made billionaire who'd started coding in her parents' garage and built an empire. And she was standing right here defending Raven. Patricia's confidence faltered. Not much. Just a flicker. But everyone saw it. The realization that she'd picked a fight with someone who had powerful allies, who was connected to people who mattered, who couldn't just be dismissed and forgotten. The Morrison mother, who'd been watching with growing horror, finally found her voice. Her toddler was calm now, sensing his mother's focus was elsewhere, watching the adults with wide, curious eyes. "I've been watching too. This is unacceptable. That child has done nothing wrong. Nothing. And she's being treated like a criminal for sitting in the seat her grandmother paid for." Gerald Kemp stood up again, all 6 feet of righteous anger and decades of accumulated wisdom. His voice carried the weight of lived experience, of battles fought and scars earned. "In all my years, I never thought I'd see this again. But here it is. Same song, different decade. This child is being discriminated against, plain and simple. And every person in this section knows it." Passengers throughout Economy Plus were nodding now. Some were still recording. Others were just watching, witnessing, bearing silent testimony to what was happening. The curtain between First Class and Economy Plus had been pulled back, and several first-class passengers were standing in the aisle, trying to see what was causing the disruption. Patricia stood at the center of it all, and for the first time in 23 years she looked uncertain. Cornered. Outnumbered. 1930 to 2200 hours. When people are losing control, they rarely recognize it in the moment. They double down. They escalate. They reach for whatever authority they have left and wield it like a weapon, not realizing that each swing only makes things worse. Patricia's voice rose to a shout. All of you need to return to your seats now, or I'll call the air marshal. This is a federal offense. You're interfering with crew member instructions. I can have every one of you arrested when we land. Empty threats. Desperate threats. The kind of threats that reveal how little power someone actually has. Douglas Hammond, the lead flight attendant who'd been trying to manage this situation by the book, finally pulled Patricia aside. He gripped her elbow and spoke in a low, urgent whisper that nevertheless carried to nearby passengers. Patricia, maybe we should. She yanked her arm away and hissed back, not as quietly as she thought. These people always play the race card. She's probably lying about the summit. They always lie. They always try to get something for nothing. Why are you taking their side? The words hung in the air like poison gas. Raven heard them. Every syllable. Every assumption. Every ugly prejudice laid bare. And something inside her cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Like ice under pressure, like glass before it shatters, like the moment before everything changes. Tears formed in her eyes, and this time she couldn't blink them away fast enough. They spilled over, hot and humiliating, running down her cheeks. But she didn't wipe them away. Didn't hide them. She let them fall. With shaking hands, Raven pulled out her acceptance folder one more time. Not for Patricia. Not for Douglas. For herself. She needed to remember why she was here. What this meant. What she'd worked for. She held up the official letter, the one with the National Youth Science Summit letterhead, the one signed by the program director, the one that represented 2 years of her life, 2 years of late nights and early mornings, 2 years of believing that intelligence and hard work could overcome anything. When Raven spoke, her voice was breaking. Not with weakness. With the kind of emotion that comes when you're forced to defend your humanity to people who should see it automatically. I'm not lying. I worked for 2 years on my project. 2 years. I won regional competitions. I beat students from private schools with unlimited resources. I was selected from thousands of students across the entire country. Thousands. And you're treating me like I don't belong here because of how I look. Because you took one look at me and decided I couldn't possibly have earned this. Couldn't possibly be smart enough. Couldn't possibly belong in this seat. The entire section fell silent. Even the toddler in row 24 had stopped fussing. The only sound was the constant hum of the aircraft engines and Raven's voice, cracking but clear, speaking truth that no one could deny. Patricia opened her mouth. I never said anything about. You didn't have to say it. Raven's words cut through Patricia's excuse like a knife. You've shown it in every action since the flight started. Every passenger around me got served. I got ignored. Every passenger's ticket was accepted. Mine got questioned. Every passenger was treated like they belonged. I was told to move to the back. You didn't have to say the words. Your actions said them for you. If this moment isn't making you want to stand up and cheer for this 12-year-old girl's courage, then you're not paying attention. Hit that subscribe button right now because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. Sylvia Chen stepped forward, placing herself between Patricia and Raven, a human shield of authority and power. When she spoke, her voice was ice. Pure. Cold. Unforgiving. I want the captain. Now. Douglas looked at Patricia, then at Sylvia, then at the dozen passengers now openly recording, then at the child whose tears were still falling but whose chin was still raised, and he made a decision. Maybe it was the right decision for the wrong reasons. Maybe it was just covering his own liability. But he made it. I'll get the captain. Patricia grabbed his arm. Douglas, you can't be serious. She's just trying to cause trouble. They always. Stop. Douglas's voice was quiet but firm. Just stop. I don't know what's happening here, but whatever it is, it's above my pay grade. The captain needs to handle this. He walked toward the cockpit, leaving Patricia standing alone in the aisle, surrounded by passengers who'd seen everything, recorded everything, witnessed everything. There was nowhere to hide. Nowhere to run. The truth had been spoken and it couldn't be unsaid. Raven sat in seat 23B, her acceptance letter still clutched in her hands, tears still on her cheeks, and waited. She'd stood tall. Just like her grandmother had taught her. She'd used her voice. She'd refused to be invisible. And somewhere in the cockpit, behind that reinforced door, someone was about to walk through that cabin. Someone who'd heard every word over the intercom system. Someone who had the authority to make this right. Someone who understood exactly what was happening, because she'd lived it herself. Here's what I want to know. When was the last time you witnessed injustice and actually did something about it? Not just felt bad. Not just posted online. Actually intervened. Drop your story in the comments because this is what separates bystanders from heroes. The cockpit door opened and everything was about to change. The cockpit door opened with a mechanical click that seemed to echo through the cabin like a judge's gavel. Every passenger in Economy Plus turned to watch as a figure emerged, silhouetted against the instrument lights behind her. Captain Victoria Hayes stepped into the cabin with the bearing of someone who'd commanded aircraft for 2 decades, someone who'd logged over 15,000 flight hours, someone who'd navigated storms and emergencies and the kind of challenges that most people never see at 35,000 feet. She was African American, late 40s, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform crisp and adorned with 4 gold stripes on each shoulder. Captain. Commander. The highest authority on this aircraft. And Patricia Holbrook's face went absolutely white. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it was almost comical. Would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. She hadn't known. In 23 years of flying and however many flights she'd worked, she'd clearly never bothered to check who was commanding this particular aircraft. She'd made assumptions just like she'd made assumptions about Raven. Victoria's eyes swept across the scene with the systematic precision of someone trained to assess situations in seconds. The 12-year-old girl in 23B with tears on her cheeks and documents clutched in her hands. The passengers standing in the aisles, phones still recording. The flight attendant who looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The lead flight attendant standing off to the side, his face a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed his own discomfort. When Victoria spoke, her voice carried authority that didn't need volume. Command presence that didn't need theatrics. I'm going to need a full explanation. And I mean full. Douglas Hammond stepped forward. To his credit, he didn't try to soften it, didn't try to spin it, didn't try to protect Patricia. He explained what he'd observed, what passengers had reported, what he'd heard himself. He was honest, clinical, factual. The kind of report you give when you know everything is being recorded and will be reviewed by people with the power to end careers. Victoria listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Douglas finished, she turned to face the passengers who'd been involved. Gerald Kemp, the Morrison mother, Brett Donovan, Sylvia Chen. Each of them added their observations, their testimony, building a picture that left no room for doubt about what had transpired. Then Victoria turned to Raven, and her expression softened just slightly. Not unprofessionally, but with the kind of understanding that comes from lived experience, from knowing exactly what this child had endured because she'd endured similar moments herself. Tell me what happened from the beginning? Raven took a shaky breath. Her hands were still trembling, but she folded them in her lap to still them. And then she spoke. Not with the raw emotion of moments before. With clarity. With precision. With the same logical, sequential thinking she applied to her scientific work. She explained how she'd been skipped during the first beverage service. How she'd asked politely for water. How Patricia had questioned her presence in Economy Plus. How she'd been told to move to the back of the plane. How her documents had been scrutinized while other passengers had been accepted without question. How she'd been accused of lying, of not belonging, of creating a disturbance when all she'd done was refuse to surrender her rightful seat. As Raven spoke, she pulled out her documentation once more. Her boarding pass. Her school ID. Her National Youth Science Summit acceptance letter. Her airline-approved unaccompanied minor paperwork. Everything that proved she had every right to be exactly where she was. Victoria took each document and examined it carefully. Not with suspicion. With thoroughness. The way a good captain checks every detail before making a decision. When she finished, she looked up at Patricia Holbrook with eyes that had seen too much, understood too much, forgiven too little. Ms. Holbrook, in 20 years of flying, I've seen this pattern before. I've experienced it myself. What I'm wondering is why you thought it was acceptable on my aircraft. Patricia stammered, her professional composure completely shattered now. Captain, I was just trying to ensure proper seating procedures were. By demanding a passenger leave their assigned seat? Victoria's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. By questioning their credentials when their documentation was in perfect order? By treating them differently than every surrounding passenger? By telling a 12-year-old child to move to the back of the plane. The words back of the plane hung in the air with all their historical weight. Everyone in that cabin knew what they echoed. Everyone understood the significance. Patricia's face reddened again, anger mixing with embarrassment. There were concerns about. I thought perhaps. You thought what exactly? Victoria wasn't letting her off the hook. Wasn't accepting vague excuses. What concern could you possibly have about a child sitting in their assigned seat with proper documentation? What made you question her presence when you questioned no one else's? I wasn't. Patricia's voice dropped to almost a whisper. There were concerns. The only concern here is your conduct. Victoria's words were final. Absolute. The only disturbance on this flight was created by you. The only passenger who's been treated inappropriately is this child, who's shown more grace and courage in the last 30 minutes than you've shown in 23 years of service. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the air circulation system, the faint whistle of wind over the fuselage, the breathing of 50 passengers who just witnessed accountability in real time. 2400 hours 3026:30. Victoria straightened, and when she spoke again, it was with the voice of command. Not angry. Not vindictive. Just absolutely certain. Ms. Holbrook, you're being suspended from service immediately upon landing. You'll be escorted off the aircraft first, and an investigation will be opened into this incident and your conduct. Your badge and credentials will be collected by the lead flight attendant. You'll have an opportunity to provide your version of events to the review board, but based on what I've witnessed and what multiple passengers have documented, I don't anticipate a favorable outcome. Patricia's shock was total. Her mouth opened and closed. Her hands reached out as if to physically grab back the words Victoria had just spoken. Captain, I've been with this airline for 23 years. 23 years of service. You can't just. Victoria's expression didn't change. Then you should know better. In those 23 years, how many other children did you treat this way? How many other passengers did you demean, dismiss, and discriminate against? How many people were too scared, too young, too intimidated to stand up to you the way this remarkable young woman did? Silence. Patricia had no answer. Or rather, the answer was written all over her face. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time she'd been caught. The first time someone had refused to back down. The first time the consequences had caught up to her actions. Victoria turned away from Patricia as if she no longer existed, as if she'd already been erased from the crew roster, and faced Raven. Her expression transformed again, warmth replacing the steel, pride replacing the anger. Miss Johnson, on behalf of this airline, this crew, and personally as the captain of this aircraft, I apologize. This should never have happened. You should never have been put in a position where you had to defend your right to occupy a seat you paid for. Where you had to prove your worth to someone who should have treated you with respect from the first moment she saw you. Raven nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Victoria continued. You're welcome to move to first class for the remainder of the flight. I'll personally ensure you're treated with the respect and dignity you deserve. It's the least we can do. It was a generous offer. An olive branch. An attempt to make amends. But Raven sat there for a moment, looking at seat 23B, thinking about what it meant to accept that offer, thinking about what it meant to refuse it. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Certain. Thank you, ma'am. But I'd like to stay here. This is my seat. I paid for it. I shouldn't have to move because someone else has a problem with me being here. Victoria's face broke into a smile. Not a professional smile. A real one. The kind of smile that comes when you recognize yourself in someone else, when you see the next generation refusing to accept what the previous generation had to endure. That's your choice and I respect it. But please let me know if you need anything. Anything at all. And Miss Johnson? Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be. Sylvia Chen stepped forward then, placing a hand gently on Raven's shoulder. She'll be sitting with me in first class by her own choice, if she'll accept my invitation. Not because she has to. Not because anyone forced her out of her seat. But because I'd be honored to spend the rest of this flight getting to know one of the brilliant young minds my company is supporting. Raven looked up at Sylvia, at this woman who'd left the comfort of first class to stand up for a stranger, who'd used her power and privilege to shield someone who needed it. And she thought about her grandmother's words. Not the ones about standing tall. The other ones. The ones about community. About how we lift each other up. I'd like that, Raven said, nodding. As Raven stood and began gathering her belongings, something remarkable happened. The passengers around her, the ones who'd witnessed everything, who'd eventually found their voices and their courage, reached out in small ways that meant everything. Gerald Kemp stepped into the aisle, his 6-foot frame somehow gentle despite its size. "Young lady, you handled yourself with more grace than most adults I know. Your grandmother raised you right. You tell her that when you call her okay? Tell her the world saw who you are today, and the world is better for it." Raven's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. Not tears of hurt and frustration. Tears of recognition. Of being seen. Of being valued. Brett Donovan stood up from seat 23A, the man who'd spent most of the flight trying to ignore everything happening 12 inches away from him. He looked uncomfortable, ashamed, but determined to say what needed to be said. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. That was cowardice on my part. I told myself it wasn't my business, that someone else would handle it, that I didn't want to get involved. But silence is a choice too. And I chose wrong. I'm sorry. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was honest." Anne Raven, who was more mature than most adults would ever be, nodded in acceptance. The Morrison mother came forward, her toddler balanced on her hip, watching everything with wide, curious eyes. "My daughter is going to hear about you. You're exactly the kind of role model she needs. Someone who stands up. Someone who doesn't back down. Someone who knows their worth. Thank you for showing her, for showing all of us what courage looks like." Other passengers added their voices. Words of support. Words of apology for not speaking up sooner. Words of admiration for a 12-year-old girl who'd done what many adults couldn't or wouldn't do. Raven gathered her backpack, her notebook, her acceptance folder, and walked toward first class with Sylvia Chen beside her. As they passed through the curtain, Raven glanced back one more time at seat 23B. Her seat. The seat she'd defended. The seat she'd refused to surrender. And in the back galley the scene was very different. Patricia Holbrook stood with her back against the bulkhead, her face a mask of shock and denial and slowly dawning horror. Douglas Hammond approached her with the kind of resolve that comes from finally doing what should have been done long ago. "I'll need your badge," he said quietly. Patricia's hands went to the silver pin on her uniform, the one that marked 23 years of service, the one she'd worn with pride. Her fingers trembled as they touched it, as if removing it would somehow unmake everything that had happened. "I didn't mean. I wasn't trying to." Douglas looked at her, and there was no anger in his expression. Just sadness. Just the weight of watching someone destroy their own career through choices they'd made, biases they'd nurtured, cruelty they'd chosen. "Yes, you were. That's exactly what you were doing. Maybe you didn't think of it that way. Maybe you've told yourself stories about protecting standards or maintaining order or whatever helps you sleep at night. But that's exactly what you were doing. Discriminating. Demeaning. Using your authority to hurt someone who couldn't hurt you back." Patricia's hands shook as she unpinned her badge and handed it over. It felt like surrendering more than a piece of metal. It felt like surrendering who she'd been for 23 years. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now." Douglas placed the badge in his pocket. "Now you'll be escorted off first when we land. You'll meet with HR and the review board. You'll probably be terminated. And somewhere, maybe years from now, maybe never, you'll understand why this happened. Why treating people differently because of how they look isn't just wrong, it's unforgivable." He walked away, leaving Patricia alone in the galley with nothing but the consequences of her choices. If watching a 12-year-old girl stand up to injustice and win doesn't make you believe in the power of courage, then nothing will. Smash that subscribe button because this story isn't quite over yet, and you need to see how it ends. In first class, Raven settled into the wide leather seat next to Sylvia Chen, her backpack stowed, her boarding pass tucked safely away. Through the window, clouds stretched endlessly, catching the late afternoon sun and turning it into gold. And Raven thought about her grandmother, waiting in Portland, unaware yet of what had happened but somehow knowing, the way grandmothers do, that her baby girl had stood tall. The engines hummed. The aircraft flew on. And the world, at least for this moment, was a little more just than it had been an hour before. What would you have done if you'd been Patricia's supervisor and found out about this incident? Would you have suspended her, fired her, or given her another chance? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. Let's talk about accountability. The sun was beginning to set as Flight 447 continued its journey eastward, carrying its passengers toward Washington, carrying Raven toward her summit, carrying everyone toward whatever came next. And somewhere far below, America scrolled past, still imperfect, still struggling, but perhaps, just perhaps, a little bit better than before. First class felt like a different world. The seats were wider, wrapped in buttersoft leather that seemed to embrace you. The lighting was warmer, more carefully designed. Even the air felt different, as if the recycled atmosphere had been filtered through something more refined up here. But none of that mattered to Raven Johnson as she settled into the seat next to Sylvia Chen. What mattered was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of being safe. Sylvia waited until Raven had buckled her seatbelt and taken a few steadying breaths before she spoke. She didn't rush, didn't fill the silence with empty words. She understood that sometimes people need space to process what they've just endured. Tell me about your water purification project. It was the perfect question. Not, are you okay? Not, that must have been hard. But an invitation to step away from what had just happened and into the work that defined Raven, the passion that had brought her on this journey in the first place. And Raven transformed. Her entire posture changed. Her eyes, which had been red-rimmed and tired, suddenly sparked with energy. Her hands, which had been folded tightly in her lap, began moving, sketching invisible diagrams in the air. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the tremor from before. This was her element. This was who she was when the world wasn't forcing her to defend her right to exist. It's a multi-stage filtration system designed specifically for communities that lack access to clean water infrastructure, Raven began, and the words poured out like water itself, clear and flowing and unstoppable. The first stage uses solar-powered UV sterilization to kill bacteria and viruses. The second stage employs a ceramic filter infused with silver nanoparticles for additional pathogen removal. The third stage is activated carbon for chemical contaminants and taste improvement. Sylvia leaned forward, genuinely engaged. This wasn't the polite interest adults sometimes show children. This was the attention of one scientist recognizing another. What about the power requirements? Solar is brilliant for sustainability, but what about communities with limited sun exposure? That's where the kinetic backup comes in, Raven explained, her enthusiasm building. There's a hand crank mechanism that can generate enough power for the UV system if solar is insufficient. And the ceramic filters work independently of power entirely. I designed it so that even if every electrical component failed, you'd still have basic filtration. Redundancy. Smart. Sylvia pulled out her tablet and started taking notes. What's your cost per unit? That's what I'm most proud of, Raven said, and for the first time since the confrontation she smiled. Really smiled. Materials cost around $47 per unit. I sourced everything from suppliers who work with developing nations. Nothing exotic. Nothing that requires specialized manufacturing. A community could theoretically build these themselves with basic instructions and locally available materials. Sylvia looked up from her tablet, and there was something like awe in her expression. $47. For a complete water purification system. Raven, do you understand what this means? There are communities paying hundreds, sometimes thousands for systems that don't work half as well. That's exactly the problem I'm trying to solve, Raven said quietly. Water shouldn't be a luxury. It's a human right. But the current solutions are either too expensive or too complicated or require infrastructure that underserved communities don't have. I wanted to create something that anyone could use, anywhere. Sylvia set down her tablet and looked at Raven with the kind of serious expression that comes before important questions. Have you thought about patent protection? Because what you've described, if it works as efficiently as you say, is worth protecting. Not to make you rich, though it certainly could. But to ensure that it actually reaches the communities that need it. Raven hadn't thought about patents. She'd thought about science. About solutions. About helping people. The business side, the legal side, that was territory she hadn't even considered. I don't know how any of that works. That's what mentors are for, Sylvia said simply. If you're interested, I'd like to help you navigate that. Quantum Core has an entire legal team that handles intellectual property. We also have a social impact division that works specifically with technologies designed for underserved communities. This is exactly the kind of project we exist to support. Raven stared at her, trying to process what was being offered. An hour ago, she'd been fighting for her right to sit in a seat. Now she was being offered mentorship by one of the most successful tech CEOs in the country. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Sylvia smiled, and it was sad and knowing and full of understanding. Because 25 years ago, I was a teenage girl with a brilliant idea and no idea how to protect it or develop it or bring it to the world. And no one helped me. I had to figure it all out alone, and I made every mistake you can possibly make. I lost opportunities. I got taken advantage of. I nearly gave up a dozen times. She paused, looking at Raven with eyes that had seen their share of battles. But more than that, what you did back there, standing up for yourself, refusing to be diminished or dismissed or moved aside, that's harder than any science project. That takes courage that most adults never develop. Intelligence without courage is just unused potential. Raven felt her throat tighten. My grandmother always says that. Intelligence without courage is just unused potential. Those are her exact words. Your grandmother sounds brilliant. Raven turned to look out the window, where clouds were beginning to thin as the aircraft started its gradual descent. Below, she could just make out the patchwork of Virginia spreading out like a quilt. Somewhere down there was Washington, D.C., somewhere down there was the summit that represented everything she'd worked for. She is, Raven said softly. She's why I do this. She raised me alone since I was 3. Worked 2 jobs until she could retire. Spent every spare dollar on books and science kits and museum memberships. She sacrificed everything to give me opportunities she never had. This project, this summit, all of it, it's for her as much as it is for the communities that need clean water. Sylvia reached over and squeezed Raven's hand gently. Then let's make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. Let's make sure your work reaches the people who need it. And let's make sure that what happened today, as terrible as it was, becomes just a small chapter in a much larger story about a brilliant young woman who changed the world. The aircraft's nose dipped slightly, beginning the descent into Washington Dulles. Through the windows, passengers could see the landscape rising to meet them, the capital city spreading out in all its planned precision. The Washington Monument. The Capitol Dome catching the last rays of sunset. The Potomac River winding through it all like a silver thread. The intercom crackled to life, and Captain Victoria Hayes' voice filled the cabin. But this wasn't the standard landing announcement. There was something different in her tone. Something personal. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright and locked positions. Before we land, however, I want to personally recognize one of our passengers. Every head in the cabin turned slightly, listening. Miss Raven Johnson is traveling today to represent the Pacific Northwest at the National Youth Science Summit. She's one of only 50 students selected from across the entire nation to present groundbreaking research that could change lives. Raven, we're all proud of you. Show them what Portland's finest can do. For a moment there was silence. Then, from the back of the plane, someone started clapping. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire aircraft erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers in economy plus, in first class, all clapping for a 12-year-old girl who'd shown them what courage looked like. Raven sat frozen in her first-class seat, tears streaming down her face. But these tears were different from the ones she'd cried an hour ago. Those had been tears of hurt and frustration and the pain of being reduced to something less than human. These were tears of recognition. Of validation. Of being seen not for what people assumed about her, but for who she actually was. The applause continued as the aircraft descended through 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. Raven wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself, but Sylvia just handed her a tissue and let her cry. Sometimes tears are necessary. Sometimes they're the only appropriate response to being fully, completely, finally seen. The wheels touched down with barely a bump, and Captain Victoria Hayes executed a landing so smooth it felt like the aircraft was being set down by gentle hands. The engines reversed with their characteristic roar, and Flight 447 taxied toward the gate, carrying its passengers safely to their destination. As promised, Patricia Holbrook was escorted off first. She walked through the jetway with her head down, her hands clutching a small bag of her personal belongings, her badge and her career stripped away. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Not the gate agents. Not the passengers waiting to board the next flight. Not her own reflection in the terminal windows. She simply walked, diminished and defeated, toward whatever consequences awaited her. Raven deplaned with Sylvia, the two of them walking side by side through the jetway like colleagues, like equals, like the mentor and mentee they were becoming. In the terminal, other passengers from the flight nodded at Raven as they passed. Some smiled. Some gave thumbs up. Gerald Kemp was waiting at the gate, and when Raven emerged, he stood and saluted her formally, the way veterans salute when they recognize someone who's fought their own kind of battle. The terminal was chaos. Passengers rushing to connections. Families reuniting. The constant drone of announcements and the rumble of rolling luggage and the universal sound of humanity in transit. But Raven barely noticed. She was searching for something specific. There. A quiet corner near the windows. A place where she could make a phone call without the world listening in. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed the number she knew better than her own name. It rang once. Twice. Then her grandmother's voice, warm as summer and solid as stone. "Baby girl? Did you land safe?" Raven's voice cracked. "Grandma? I'm here. And I have so much to tell you." Tell me what, honey? How could she even begin? How could she explain what had happened at 35,000 feet? How could she convey both the hurt and the triumph, the discrimination and the justice, the fear and the courage? But the most important thing is, you were right. I stood tall. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Loretta's voice came through, thick with tears and pride and the kind of love that transcends distance and time and every challenge the world throws at you. I never doubted you for a second, baby girl. Not for 1 second. Now tell me everything. And Raven did. Standing there in Dulles International Airport, watching the sun set through the massive windows, she told her grandmother everything. About Patricia and the water she'd been denied and the seat she'd defended and the passengers who'd finally found their voices and the captain who'd made it right. She told her about Sylvia Chen and the mentorship being offered and the possibilities opening up like flowers in spring. Loretta listened to every word, and when Raven finally finished, she said simply, "Your mama and daddy would be so proud. I'm so proud. You did what was right even when it was hard. That's all anyone can ask of you." Through the terminal windows, Raven could see the Capitol dome in the distance, lit up against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that building, people were making decisions that affected millions of lives. Somewhere in this city, the National Youth Science Summit was preparing to showcase the next generation of innovators and problem solvers and world changers. Anne Raven Johnson, 12 years old, raised by her grandmother in Portland, Oregon, stood tall and looked at that dome and understood something fundamental. Change doesn't always happen in grand gestures and sweeping legislation. Sometimes it happens in airplane seats at 35,000 feet. Sometimes it happens when one person refuses to move, refuses to be diminished, refuses to accept that the world gets to define their worth. "I love you, Grandma," Raven whispered. "I love you too, baby girl. Now go show them what you're made of." Raven ended the call and stood there for another moment, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her acceptance folder tucked safely inside, her water purification project waiting to be presented to people who could help it reach the communities that needed it most. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. The airport hummed with life. Anne Raven Johnson walked forward into her future, head high, shoulders back, standing tall. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own moments of courage or cowardice, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that change is possible, that justice can prevail, that courage can be found in the most unlikely places. The screen faded to black, but the message remained. Stand tall. Stand up. Stand together. Because that's how the world changes. One brave act at a time. Here's my final question for you. What will be your moment? When will you choose to stand tall for yourself or someone else? When will you stop being a bystander and become the person who makes a difference? Think about it. Then do it. The world is waiting.